Hello friends, do you end up getting postoperative corneal striate keratopathy even after uneventful Phaco and even in grade 1 to 2 nuclear sclerotic cataracts? Now there is possibly an explanation for this, and let's take a look at two surgical clips. And here goes the first clip. This surgery was performed by a temporal Phaco by my junior consultant, who complained to me that she was getting striate keratopathy even in uncomplicated cases, and even if she was handling just grade 1 or grade 2 nuclear sclerotic cataract. If you observe the surgery, you find that although she is slow and guarded in her approach, there is a meticulous handling of the nucleus fragments which are performed with the Phaco emulsification. She's using a Phaco power of just 30%, a vacuum of 300 millimeters of mercury, and she's using the pulse mode of Phaco emulsification. Observe the surgery carefully and see if you can make out any particular glitches or drawbacks in the surgical technique that's being employed. The procedure that's being done is a stop and chop technique of Phaco emulsification. Now let's move on to the second clip, and this is a surgical video of my own surgery of a similar grade of nuclear sclerotic cataract, where I'm using a superior approach and I'm using the direct Phaco chop technique. The settings are more or less the same. I'm also using a Phaco power of just 30% and a vacuum of 300 millimeters of mercury, except that I'm probably using a multiburst mode or a hyperpulse mode instead of a pulse mode of Phaco. In this particular case, there was no striate keratopathy and the cornea appeared crystal clear in the first postoperative day. Like in the previous case, the nucleus fragments are mobilized and brought to the central safe zone where they are emulsified. I'm just going to let it for you to observe the case carefully and see if you can make out what could be the main difference. So now let's go to the explanation in these two cases. In both cases, we used the standard Phaco tip with a 30-degree bevel. The fragment removal was done with more or less the same settings of 30% power, pulse mode in her case and micropulse in mine, and a vacuum of 300 millimeters of mercury. In both cases also, you find that the fragments were emulsified only in the central safe zone. Yet, the first case had mild corneal striate keratopathy on the first post-op day, whereas in the second case, the cornea was crystal clear. So what was the difference in these two cases? Well, the answer, I think, lies in the plane of Phaco emulsification, or the depth at which Phaco is performed. When viewed coaxially through the operating microscope, the actual depth of the Phaco probe with respect to the cornea is very difficult to assess. Because while trenching or lollipopping the nucleus for the chop, the Phaco probe is at the plane of the nucleus and is well away from the cornea, and this can be appreciated only by a side view. However, during the fragment removal, the fragment is moved out of the capsular bag into the central zone. At this point, the fragment can be emulsified at the supracapsular plane or the iris plane, which is safe, or it may be emulsified totally in the anterior chamber, which is pretty unsafe as the Phaco tip lies close to the endothelium. And since it's not easy to gauge the depth while viewing coaxially through the operating microscope, is there any way of knowing at which plane we are actually performing the Phaco emulsification, as coaxial viewing does not seem to give us any clues? Now this is a standard 30-degree Phaco tip with a bevel of 30 degrees, and this is what most of us use for Phaco emulsification. When this tip is held in the bevel up position, the more horizontally the tip is held within the anterior chamber, the more of the bevel that will be visible under the microscope or close to the corneal endothelium. And this is a very shallow depth to which we are holding the Phaco tip. When the tip is being held at the iris or the supracapsular plane in the bevel up position, the downward angulation of the tip will make the bevel less visible. And if you are angulating the tip at 30 degrees in the downward direction, the bevel is not visible when viewed coaxially through the operating microscope. Now this is a very subtle sign. Hence, simply put, visibility of the bevel of a 30-degree phaco tip gives us an indirect measurement of the depth in which the fragment emulsification is taking place and could guide us actually towards safe emulsification by helping us to gauge the depth at which the phaco procedure is being conducted. Unfortunately, this sign could be applied only if you're using straight tip and it cannot be used for bent tip. It can be applied to all types of tips, standard tips, ABS tips, or even Cobra tips, as long as you're holding the tip in the bevel up position, which is the only drawback. With this information, let's look at the first two clips again and see if we understand more than we did when we looked at it the first time around. So going back to the first clip, the surgeon is performing a trenching maneuver. You find that the bevel is not visible because the phaco tip is angulated posteriorly. And this is of course necessary in order to reach the nucleus surface, either for trenching or for chopping. Whether you're doing stop and chop or a direct chop, to perform any sort of maneuver within the bag, the tip has to be angulated posteriorly. However, you can clearly see that while performing the fragment removal in this case, the surgeon is holding the piece in the central zone. The bevel is clearly exposed, which means that she is holding the phaco tip in a horizontal position. This automatically means that she is close to the endothelium, and because the nucleus fragments will lollipop onto the surface of the phaco tip, the nucleus fragments are also brought very close to the endothelium, and the breakaway fragments can hit against the endothelium, as well as the emulsification or cavitational power can also hit against the endothelium, which is probably the reason why the patient had striate keratopathy. Let's take a look at the second clip of mine. So this is the direct phaco chop which I am doing, and you see that the bevel is not visible. I'm actually using the same 30-degree standard phaco tip held in the bevel up position. Irrespective of whether you are doing a direct chop or a stop and chop, during nucleus breakdown or cracking, you always need to go into the bag, and hence the bevel is held in the correct position. It's only while doing fragment removal that we are unable to gauge the depth or the plane at which emulsification is occurring. See that I'm actually angulating the probe in such a way that the bevel is not visible. This means that even though it's difficult to gauge from a coaxial viewing between the two cases, the depth at which the emulsification is occurring is at a much deeper plane, that is in the supracapsular or the iris plane. And this is probably the reason why the safety margin is more, and you can end up getting much clearer corneas. So try to make this slight adaptation if you're using a standard 30-degree tip held in the bevel up mode, and you will see amazing results in your post-op cases. Thank you for your attention.